The Ars Goetia, literally translating to the art of sorcery or the howling art, stands as one of the most influential and enduring grimoires in the Western esoteric tradition. This medieval text, forming the first and most widely studied section of the Lesser Key of Solomon, Clavicula Salomonis Regis, represents a complex synthesis of ancient Near Eastern magical traditions, medieval Christian theology, and Renaissance humanist scholarship. The work catalogues 72 demonic entities in meticulous detail, providing descriptions of their appearances, hierarchical positions, supernatural abilities, and the ritual procedures allegedly required for summoning them. However, modern, academic scholarship increasingly approaches the Ars Goetia not as a literal manual for supernatural contact, but as a sophisticated psychological and cultural artifact that offers unprecedented insight into medieval European consciousness, the evolution of religious thought, and the universal human struggle to understand and categorize the darker aspects of existence. The origins of the Ars Goetia are deeply rooted in the ancient magical traditions of the Mediterranean world, drawing from Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman sources that were later filtered through Jewish mysticism and Christian theology. The text as we know it today likely emerged in the 17th century, though it incorporates material that can be traced back to the early medieval period and beyond. The attribution to King Solomon reflects a widespread medieval tradition that associated the biblical monarch with magical wisdom and the ability to command spirits. This attribution served both to legitimize the text within a Christian framework and to connect it to the broader Solomonic magical tradition that included works such as the Testament of Solomon and various Hebrew magical texts. The historical development of the Ars Goetia cannot be separated from the broader context of medieval European intellectual life. During the 12th and 13th centuries, European scholars gained access to a vast corpus of Greek, Arabic and Hebrew texts through the translation movements centered in Spain, Sicily, and southern Italy. These translations included not only philosophical and scientific works, but also magical and astrological texts that had been preserved and developed in the Islamic world. The Ars Goetia represents the culmination of this cross-cultural exchange, synthesizing elements from diverse magical traditions into a coherent system that reflected medieval Christian cosmology while incorporating sophisticated magical techniques. From non-Christian sources, the text's emphasis on hierarchical organization reflects the feudal structure of medieval society, with demons arranged in a complex bureaucracy that mirrors earthly political systems. Each entity is assigned a specific rank, king, duke, prince, president, count, or marquis, and commands a precise number of legions, creating an infernal administrative system that would have been immediately recognizable to medieval readers. This organizational structure served multiple functions. It made the chaotic realm of the demonic comprehensible within familiar social categories. It established clear chains of command and responsibility, and it provided a framework for understanding how supernatural forces might be approached and negotiated with using the diplomatic protocols of the medieval world. Baal, whose name derives from the ancient Canaanite deity Baal, occupies the first position in the Ars Goetia's hierarchy, a placement that is far from coincidental. As the opening figure in this catalogue of supernatural entities, Baal serves as a threshold guardian, embodying the transition from the known world of ordinary consciousness into the hidden realm of esoteric knowledge. The demon's triple-headed appearance, combining the forms of a man, a cat, and a toad, represents a sophisticated symbolic system that operates on multiple levels of meaning. The human head symbolizes rational consciousness and the capacity for abstract thought, while the cat represents intuitive wisdom, nocturnal awareness, and the ability to navigate hidden realms. The toad, often associated with transformation and the absorption of toxins, symbolizes the alchemical process of transmuting base experience into spiritual wisdom. From a psychological perspective, Baal embodies what Carl Jung termed the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that bridges conscious and unconscious content. The demon's power of invisibility represents not merely physical concealment, but the ability to move between different levels of reality without being constrained by ordinary perceptual limitations. This power carries profound implications for the practitioner's sense of identity and social connection. The invisibility that Baal offers is not simply a tactical advantage, but a fundamental alteration of one's relationship to the world and to oneself. Those who successfully integrate Baal's teachings often report a sense of detachment from social conventions and expectations, a freedom that can be both liberating and isolating. The historical roots of Baal's symbolism can be traced to the ancient Near Eastern understanding of divine hiddenness and the mystery religions of the Greco-Roman world. The Canaanite Baal was originally a storm god associated with fertility and agricultural abundance, but his transformation into a demon of concealment reflects the Christian demonization of pagan deities. This transformation is not merely polemical, but represents a sophisticated theological adaptation that preserved the essential symbolic function of the deity while relocating it within a Christian cosmological framework. The storm god's power over natural forces becomes the demon's power over perception and visibility, maintaining the essential theme of hidden power manifesting in unexpected ways. The psychological dangers associated with Baal's influence reflect genuine risks inherent in the pursuit of esoteric knowledge. The practitioner who becomes too comfortable with invisibility may find it increasingly difficult to maintain meaningful human relationships or to engage authentically with the world. This reflects a broader pattern in magical and mystical traditions, where advanced practitioners often experience a form of spiritual inflation that separates them from ordinary human experience. The medieval authors of grimoire literature were acutely aware of these risks, which is why they embedded their instructions within elaborate protective frameworks and cautionary warnings. Paimon represents one of the most complex and psychologically sophisticated figures in the entire Ars Goetia, embodying the archetype of the divine teacher who offers knowledge that fundamentally transforms the recipient's understanding of reality. The demon's arrival is described in terms that suggest a cosmic event, riding upon winds, accompanied by invisible choirs and heralded by celestial trumpets that seem to echo from beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. This elaborate entrance serves multiple symbolic functions. It establishes Paimon's authority as a teacher of cosmic mysteries. It creates a sense of awe and reverence appropriate to the reception of sacred knowledge, and it warns of the overwhelming nature of the wisdom that is about to be transmitted. The description of Paimon as loyal to Lucifer himself places this figure within a specific theological framework that reflects medieval Christian understanding of the relationship between knowledge and spiritual rebellion. In this context, Paimon represents knowledge that exists outside the boundaries of divine revelation, wisdom that is true and powerful, but potentially dangerous because it challenges established religious and social hierarchies. This positioning reflects the medieval Christian ambivalence towards secular learning and natural philosophy, fields that were simultaneously valued for their practical benefits and suspected of leading to spiritual pride and separation from God. From a depth, psychological perspective, Paimon embodies what Jung called the wise old man archetype in its shadow form. While the positive expression of this archetype appears as the helpful teacher or mentor who guides the hero's journey, Paimon represents the dark side of this function, the teacher who provides knowledge without regard for the student's capacity to integrate it constructively. This figure appears in many mythological traditions as the trickster teacher who offers genuine wisdom, but in a form that tests or potentially destroys the recipient. The Greek myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, provides a classical parallel to Paimon's function as a transmitter of divine knowledge to mortal consciousness. The specific types of knowledge that Paimon is said to provide, sciences, arts, philosophy, and the secret workings of creation, reflect the medieval understanding of the liberal arts and their relationship to spiritual development. In the medieval educational system, the liberal arts were divided into the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These subjects were considered preparatory to the study of theology, the queen of sciences. Paimon's mastery of all these areas, combined with his knowledge of secret or hidden aspects of creation, positions him as a figure who offers shortcuts to learning that bypass the traditional educational sequence and its built-in safeguards. The psychological consequences of receiving Paimon's teachings reflect genuine risks associated with rapid spiritual or intellectual development. The reports of practitioners experiencing overwhelming dreams, spontaneous trances, and compulsive symbolic expression suggest a process of unconscious activation that exceeds the ego's capacity for integration. This phenomenon is well documented in the psychological literature on spiritual emergence and creative inspiration, where individuals may experience breakthrough insights accompanied by temporary psychological instability. The medieval grimoire tradition's emphasis on careful preparation and protective measures reflects an intuitive understanding of these risks and the need for structured approaches to consciousness expansion. Asmodeus occupies a unique position within the demonic hierarchy as the ruler of lust, desire, and the hidden dynamics of human relationships. Unlike many other demons who operate primarily in the realms of knowledge or power, Asmodeus works directly with the fundamental biological and psychological drives that motivate human behavior. His influence extends beyond simple sexual desire to encompass the entire spectrum of human longing, for connection, for pleasure, for possession, and for the validation that comes from being desired by others. From a psychological perspective, Asmodeus represents the shadow side of the human capacity for intimacy and connection, embodying both the creative and destructive potential inherent in our deepest desires. The demon's composite appearance, combining human, serpentine, and draconic elements, reflects the complex nature of human sexuality and desire. The human face represents the conscious, rational aspect of desire, while the serpentine body evokes the ancient association between serpents and both wisdom and temptation. The dragon wings suggest the power of desire to lift consciousness to extraordinary heights or to carry it into dangerous territory. This symbolic synthesis reflects the medieval Christian understanding of sexuality as a force that could lead either toward spiritual transcendence through sanctified marriage or toward spiritual destruction through lust and adultery. Historically, Asmodeus appears in the deuterocanonical Book of Tobit, where he is described as a demon who kills the husbands of Sarah on their wedding nights. This narrative establishes Asmodeus as a force that disrupts the normal course of human relationships and prevents the consummation of legitimate unions. However, the demon's ultimate defeat by the archangel Raphael, using the smoke of a burning fish heart and liver, suggests that natural remedies and divine intervention can overcome destructive desires. This story provides the theological foundation for understanding Asmodeus as a demon whose power, while formidable, can be successfully resisted through proper spiritual preparation and divine assistance. The Ars Goetia's portrayal of Asmodeus as a teacher of mathematics and geometry, alongside his governance of desire, reflects the medieval understanding of the relationship between intellectual and sensual appetites. In medieval moral theology, both intellectual pride and sensual lust were considered forms of concupiscence, disordered desires that drew the soul away from its proper relationship with God. The demon's ability to reveal hidden treasures suggests the medieval belief that both intellectual and sensual pursuits could lead to the discovery of earthly goods, but at the cost of spiritual treasure. This duality reflects the broader medieval tension between the pursuit of worldly knowledge and goods and the cultivation of spiritual wisdom and virtue. From a Jungian perspective, Asmodeus represents the archetypal function of the shadow lover, the aspect of the psyche that carries our repressed or unacknowledged desires and fantasies. Integration of this shadow material is essential for psychological wholeness, but it requires careful attention to boundaries and ethical considerations. The demon's seductive approach reflects the way shadow material often presents itself as attractive and beneficial, making it difficult to recognize its potentially destructive aspects. The gradual erosion of moral restraint that characterizes Asmodeus's influence parallels the psychological process by which repressed desires, once acknowledged, can begin to dominate consciousness if they are not integrated with wisdom and ethical reflection. Belial represents perhaps the most philosophically complex figure in the entire Ars Goetia, embodying the archetypal tension between individual sovereignty and social responsibility. The demon's name, derived from the Hebrew Belial, meaning worthless or without profit, initially appears to contradict his function as a grantor of worldly success and political power. However, this apparent contradiction reflects a sophisticated theological insight about the nature of worldly achievement and its relationship to spiritual value. In the biblical tradition, Belial often refers not to simple worthlessness, but to independence from divine authority, a condition that may appear successful in worldly terms, but is ultimately spiritually barren. The historical development of Belial as a demonic figure reflects the evolution of Jewish and Christian thinking about the relationship between secular and religious authority. In the Hebrew Bible, sons of Belial are individuals who act without regard for divine law or social responsibility. The transformation of this concept into a specific demonic entity reflects the medieval Christian tendency to personify abstract moral and spiritual principles. Belial becomes the patron demon of those who seek power and influence without acknowledging their dependence on divine grace or their responsibility to serve the common good. From a psychological perspective, Belial embodies what modern psychology recognizes as narcissistic leadership, the pursuit of power and influence primarily for personal gratification rather than for service to others. The demon's promise to grant authority and influence without chains reflects the narcissistic fantasy of unlimited power without corresponding responsibility or accountability. This type of leadership may appear successful in the short term, as it often involves charismatic manipulation and strategic thinking that can achieve impressive results. However, the long-term consequences typically include the deterioration of relationships, the isolation of the leader, and the ultimate collapse of whatever systems or organizations they have built. The ritual requirements for summoning Belial, including the use of dragon's blood incense, silver coins, and written oaths, reflect the medieval understanding of the relationship between material symbols and spiritual realities. Dragon's blood, a resin obtained from various plants, was associated with Mars and the element of fire, suggesting aggressive, masculine energy. Silver, associated with the moon and feminine receptivity, creates a balance that prevents the Martian energy from becoming purely destructive. The written oath represents the medieval legal tradition of sealed contracts and formal agreements, emphasizing that the relationship with Belial involves specific commitments and exchanges rather than simple supplication. The psychological consequences of working with Belial's energy, increased confidence and strategic thinking, accompanied by decreased empathy and increased manipulation, reflect the natural development of leadership skills in the absence of ethical constraints. Many effective leaders possess strong Belial-like qualities. They are confident, strategic, persuasive, and willing to make difficult decisions. However, when these qualities develop without corresponding growth in empathy, ethical reasoning, and service orientation, they can become destructive both to the leader and to those they influence. The medieval grimoire tradition's emphasis on careful preparation and protective measures reflects an understanding that leadership energy, like any powerful force, requires careful channeling to prevent it from becoming destructive. Bouer presents one of the most intriguing paradoxes in the entire Ars Goetia, a demon specifically associated with healing, philosophy, and moral instruction. This apparent contradiction, a demonic entity devoted to beneficial activities, reflects sophisticated medieval thinking about the relationship between healing and spiritual transformation. In the medieval worldview, true healing often required confronting uncomfortable truths about oneself and one's life circumstances. Physical illness was frequently understood as a manifestation of spiritual or moral imbalance, meaning that effective treatment required addressing root causes that might be painful or challenging to acknowledge. The demon's unusual appearance, a He-1-E figure with 5 legs radiating from a central body, moving in a wheel-like motion, combines elements of human anatomy with geometric symbolism that suggests movement, balance, and the integration of multiple perspectives. The number 5 holds special significance in medieval symbolism, representing the human form, head, arms, and legs, as well as the 5 senses through which we perceive and interact with the world. The wheel-like motion suggests the cyclical nature of healing processes and the need for balanced, sustained movement rather than linear progress toward a fixed goal. From a historical perspective, Buer's association with healing reflects the medieval Christian ambivalence toward medical knowledge and practice. During the medieval period, much of the most advanced medical knowledge came from Islamic and Jewish sources, making it suspect in the eyes of Orthodox Christian authorities. The figure of the demonic healer represents the shadow side of medical practice, the physician whose knowledge and methods are effective, but whose ultimate loyalty lies outside the Christian community and its values. This figure embodies the medieval Christian fear that healing the body might come at the cost of endangering the soul. The philosophical and moral instruction that Buer is said to provide reflects the medieval understanding of the relationship between physical health and spiritual wisdom. In the medieval medical tradition, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman sources, physical health was understood to depend on the proper balance of humors, which in turn was influenced by moral and spiritual factors. A physician who could effectively treat physical ailments was therefore assumed to possess insights into the moral and spiritual dimensions of human experience. However, the demonic nature of this knowledge suggests that such insights, while accurate and useful, might come from sources that are ultimately opposed to human spiritual welfare. From a depth psychological perspective, Buer represents the archetypal, wounded healer, the figure who gains the ability to heal others through their own experience of suffering and recovery. This archetype appears in many mythological traditions, from the Greek myth of Chiron the centaur to the Christian understanding of Christ's redemptive suffering. However, Buer represents the shadow aspect of this archetype, the healer whose own wounds have not been fully integrated and who therefore transmits both healing and wounding to those they treat. This figure reflects the reality that many effective healers and therapists are drawn to their work through their own experience of psychological or spiritual crisis, and that their effectiveness often depends on their ability to transform their personal wounds into sources of wisdom and compassion. The systematic study of the Ars Goetia through the lens of analytical psychology reveals remarkable parallels between the medieval understanding of demonic entities and modern psychological theories about the structure and dynamics of the human psyche. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious provides a particularly useful framework for understanding how these demonic figures function as archetypal representations of universal human psychological patterns. Each demon in the Ars Goetia can be understood as embodying specific aspects of what Jung called the shadow, the repressed, denied, or undeveloped aspects of the personality that operate outside conscious awareness but continue to influence behavior and experience. The process of summoning these demonic figures, when understood psychologically rather than literally, represents a sophisticated form of active imagination, a technique that Jung developed for consciously engaging with unconscious content. The elaborate ritual preparations described in the grimoire tradition serve psychological functions that parallel modern therapeutic practices. They create a safe, contained space for exploring dangerous psychological material. They establish clear boundaries between ordinary consciousness and the altered state required for shadow work, and they provide structured methods for integrating insights and experiences that emerge during the process. The protective circles, consecrated tools, and formal invocations that characterize grimoire practice can be understood as external representations of the psychological boundaries and ethical frameworks that are essential for safe exploration of shadow material. Without these protective structures, the practitioner risks being overwhelmed by unconscious content or losing their capacity for ethical discrimination. The medieval emphasis on moral preparation and spiritual protection reflects an intuitive understanding of the psychological risks inherent in confronting repressed or denied aspects of the personality. The hierarchical organization of demonic entities in the Ars Goetia reflects the complex, multi-layered structure of the human psyche, as understood in depth psychology. The different ranks of demons, kings, dukes, presidents, and marquises, correspond to different levels of psychological organization and different degrees of autonomy within the psychic system. The kings represent fundamental archetypal forces that operate with considerable independence from conscious control, while lower-ranking entities represent more specific psychological complexes or behavioral patterns that may be more easily influenced by conscious intention. The specific powers and abilities attributed to each demon correspond to particular psychological functions or capacities that may be underdeveloped or repressed in ordinary consciousness. Baal's power of invisibility represents the capacity for objective self-observation and the ability to move through social situations without being constrained by conventional expectations. Paimon's gift of knowledge represents the capacity for insight and understanding that operates independently of formal education or social conditioning. Asmodeus's governance of desire represents the capacity for passionate engagement with life that transcends conventional moral and social boundaries. Belial's promise of power represents the capacity for effective leadership and influence that operates independently of external validation or approval. Buer's healing abilities represent the capacity for wisdom and compassion that emerges from the integration of personal suffering and recovery. The influence of the Ars Goetia on Western literature and popular culture extends far beyond its origins in medieval occultism, permeating centuries of artistic and intellectual development. The systematic cataloging of supernatural entities provided a template that influenced everything from Dante's elaborate hierarchies in the Divine Comedy to modern fantasy literature and role-playing games. The text's combination of classical learning, Christian theology, and magical practice established a model for how supernatural forces could be understood and represented within a coherent cosmological framework. During the Renaissance, the Ars Goetia and related grimoire literature influenced the development of literary works that explored the relationship between knowledge, power, and moral responsibility. Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus draws explicitly on grimoire traditions in its portrayal of a scholar who makes a pact with demonic forces in exchange for knowledge and power. The play's exploration of the consequences of such a pact reflects the medieval understanding of the spiritual risks inherent in the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Similarly, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust engages with grimoire traditions while developing a more psychologically sophisticated understanding of the relationship between desire, knowledge, and spiritual development. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries found in the Ars Goetia and related texts a rich source of imagery and symbolism for exploring the darker aspects of human experience. Writers such as Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and William Blake drew on grimoire traditions to create literary works that challenged conventional religious and moral assumptions while exploring themes of rebellion, desire, and the pursuit of transcendence. The Romantic emphasis on individual experience and the exploration of extreme psychological states found natural affinity with the grimoire tradition's focus on the direct encounter with supernatural forces. In the 20th century, the influence of the Ars Goetia expanded beyond literature to encompass psychology, anthropology, and comparative religion. Carl Jung's extensive study of alchemical and magical texts, including grimoire literature, informed his development of analytical psychology and his understanding of the collective unconscious. Mircea Eliade's comparative study of religious and magical traditions drew on grimoire literature to illuminate universal patterns in human spiritual experience. Joseph Campbell's work on the hero's journey incorporated insights from grimoire traditions about the process of encountering and integrating shadow material. Contemporary popular culture continues to draw extensively on the imagery and symbolism of the Ars Goetia, though often in forms that are far removed from the original medieval context. Horror films, fantasy novels, and role-playing games frequently incorporate demonic figures and magical systems that derive ultimately from grimoire traditions. While these popular adaptations often lack the psychological and spiritual sophistication of the original texts, they demonstrate the continuing power of these archetypal figures to capture the human imagination and to provide symbolic representations of fundamental psychological dynamics. Contemporary academic study of the Ars Goetia and related grimoire literature has moved far beyond the dismissive attitudes that characterized earlier scholarly approaches. Modern researchers in fields such as religious studies, psychology, anthropology, and literary criticism have developed sophisticated methods for understanding these texts as complex cultural artifacts that illuminate important aspects of human experience and social organization. Rather than dismissing grimoire literature as mere superstition or primitive magical thinking, contemporary scholars recognize these texts as sophisticated symbolic systems that encode important insights about consciousness, social dynamics, and spiritual development. In the field of psychology, the Ars Goetia has found particular relevance in the development of therapeutic approaches that work with archetypal material and shadow integration. Jungian analysts and other depth-oriented therapists have adapted grimoire techniques for use in therapeutic contexts, using the systematic exploration of archetypal figures as a method for helping clients identify and integrate repressed or denied aspects of their personality. The elaborate protective frameworks and ethical guidelines that characterize grimoire practice provide valuable models for ensuring that such therapeutic work remains safe and beneficial for clients. The use of grimoire-inspired techniques in therapy requires careful adaptation to ensure that the work remains grounded in psychological rather than supernatural assumptions. Therapists who work with these methods typically emphasize that the demons being explored are psychological rather than literal entities, representing aspects of the client's own psyche rather than external supernatural forces. The ritual elements of grimoire practice, such as the creation of protective circles and the use of symbolic objects, are understood as techniques for creating appropriate therapeutic boundaries and for accessing altered states of consciousness that facilitate insight and integration. Research in the field of consciousness studies has found that the systematic exploration of archetypal material, as exemplified in grimoire practice, can produce measurable changes in psychological functioning and well-being. Studies of individuals who engage in intensive shadow work often show increased creativity, emotional resilience, and capacity for intimate relationships. However, this research also confirms the medieval understanding that such work carries significant risks and requires careful preparation and ongoing support. The protective frameworks that characterize traditional grimoire practice have proven to be essential for preventing psychological destabilization and ensuring that the insights gained through shadow work can be successfully integrated into daily life. The anthropological study of grimoire literature has revealed important insights about the relationship between magical practice and social organization. The elaborate hierarchies and formal procedures that characterize texts like the Ars Goetia reflect broader patterns in how human societies organize and manage power relationships. The grimoire tradition's emphasis on careful preparation, formal protocols and protective measures provides a model for how dangerous or disruptive social forces can be channeled in constructive directions. This understanding has informed contemporary approaches to conflict resolution, organizational development, and community healing that draw on traditional wisdom while adapting it to modern contexts. The Ars Goetia remains one of the most significant documents in the Western esoteric tradition, not because of its literal instructions for supernatural contact, but because of its sophisticated understanding of the psychological and spiritual dynamics that govern human experience. The text's systematic exploration of archetypal forces, its emphasis on careful preparation and ethical guidelines, and its recognition of the transformative power of shadow work continue to offer valuable insights for contemporary readers seeking to understand the deeper dimensions of consciousness and spiritual development. The 5 major figures examined in this analysis, Baal, Paimon, Asmodeus, Belial, and Buer, represent fundamental aspects of human psychology that transcend their medieval origins. Their continued appearance in literature, psychology, and popular culture demonstrates their enduring relevance as symbols of universal human experiences and challenges. Each figure embodies specific psychological functions and capacities that may be underdeveloped or repressed in ordinary consciousness, offering pathways for growth and integration that remain as relevant today as they were in the medieval period. The study of the Ars Goetia also illuminates important aspects of the relationship between individual psychological development and broader social and cultural dynamics. The text's emphasis on hierarchy, formal protocols, and ethical guidelines reflects an understanding that personal transformation cannot be separated from social responsibility and community involvement. The dangers associated with each demonic figure reflect genuine risks that accompany the development of psychological and spiritual capacities in the absence of appropriate ethical frameworks and community support. Perhaps most importantly, the Ars Goetia demonstrates the human capacity to create sophisticated symbolic systems for understanding and working with the most challenging aspects of existence. The text's combination of classical learning, Christian theology, and practical psychology represents a remarkable achievement in the history of human thought, providing a framework for understanding consciousness that remains relevant and useful more than 4 centuries after its composition. As contemporary society continues to grapple with questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between individual and collective well-being, and the proper use of power and knowledge, the wisdom embedded in texts like the Ars Goetia continues to offer valuable guidance and insight.